I never thought my life would be one of those twisted stories you hear about on daytime TV. I was a regular guy, just trying to build a life with the woman I loved, in the kind of quiet neighborhood where people keep their lawns trimmed. Kids play in cul-de-sacs, and everyone nods politely at each other on the street. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, raised with a firm set of beliefs, family first, always. My marriage to Evelyn wasn't perfect, but it was ours, built on years of shared memories and a quiet rhythm that I thought signified contentment. We met at college, two dreamers in a small lecture hall. She was passionate about environmental science. I was a guy with a pragmatic mind majoring in engineering. And somehow, our paths merged. I could still remember the smile that spread across her face the first time I made her laugh. And it was the kind of smile that pulled you in. Like gravity, it was easy to fall in love with her, probably too easy. After a few years of dating, we tied the knot, and those early days were as close to a fairy tale as I'd ever get. Fast forward 10 years, and the fairy tale was harder to recognize. Life chipped away at the things that made us close. Work demands grew, responsibilities filled our days, leaving little room for romance or spontaneity. Our conversations became about bills, grocery lists, and vague plans for vacations that never happened. Evelyn's focus shifted toward community activism, with late meetings, weekend events, and endless causes she poured herself into. I, meanwhile, became consumed by the endless projects and deadlines of my engineering job. But despite the small cracks, I held firm to the belief that we were still solid. We were just busy. Life happens, I told myself. This is marriage. Not every day could be a honeymoon. I'd see friends going through rough patches, and I'd remind myself that commitment was about weathering the storms, waiting for the sunshine to come back out. Then the distance between us started growing. Evelyn grew more distracted, less present at home, spending nights away, absorbed in her projects. I remember telling myself I was just being paranoid. I knew she loved her work, and I wanted to support her passions, even if they kept her away from me more than I liked. I convinced myself this was just a phase, that we'd reconnect once things settled down. But then, I started catching glimpses, fleeting, disturbing glimpses of something else beneath the surface. A text that flashed on her phone, a name I didn't recognize, or the way she'd turn away when I entered the room while she was on a call. That nagging feeling started to grow, a persistent itch in the back of my mind, and as much as I tried to ignore it, push it down, it wouldn't go away. The small suspicions didn't stay small. They began to fester, eroding what little peace of mind I had left. I'd lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying our days in my mind, searching for clues in every little gesture, every offhand comment. I became haunted by the question, what if she was hiding something from me? What if the woman I promised my life to had broken her promises to me? I told myself I was overthinking it, that I needed to trust her. But trust isn't blind, it relies on mutual respect, openness, and honesty, and I could feel those foundations slipping away. I wanted to confront her, but at the same time, I feared what I'd find. The idea of our marriage, our life together unraveling, was almost too much to bear. The life we'd built together, the love we'd shared, felt as fragile as glass, and I was terrified of shattering it. In that uneasy limbo, I held on, caught between doubt and hope, waiting for some sign, some certainty that would tell me what to do. I told myself this was just a phase of life, of marriage. But deep down, I knew the foundation was shifting beneath my feet. The signs started subtle, easy to miss if I hadn't been looking so hard. Evelyn had a habit of staying out late work events, she said, or meetings with her environmental group. She was always organizing something, campaigning for cleaner water, protesting against some new development that would harm local wildlife. I'd always admired her passion, her dedication to causes that felt larger than our small lives. But now, that very passion became the shield she hid behind. Or at least, that's how it felt. It was the little things at first. Her phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter or the bedside table, was now flipped over, notifications flashing on the black screen that I couldn't see. She'd get a call and leave the room. Sometimes she'd mumble something about a committee member, or a friend from the group. But I started noticing the way her voice would soften, words tumbling out in whispers that sounded too intimate for professional calls. I started doubting myself, wondering if my suspicions were nothing but paranoia, the result of a tired mind and a drifting marriage. But each time I tried to brush it off, more signs would emerge, glaringly obvious and impossible to ignore. A random text notification from someone named Mike at 2 in the morning. A receipt for a dinner at a restaurant where I hadn't dined in years. I told myself there were explanations, reasonable ones, but the more I thought about it, the weaker my excuses sounded. Eventually, my curiosity overpowered my guilt, and one night, I went through her phone while she was in the shower. I'm not proud of it. It felt wrong, like I was breaking some unspoken rule of marriage. But I had to know. My heart was pounding as I scrolled through her messages, looking for anything that would confirm or deny the doubts gnawing at my heart. That's when I found it. A long thread of messages between her and Mike. The words were there, plain as day, confessions of love, of stolen moments, promises whispered in the dark. Each word was a dagger, driving deeper into my chest, turning the knot in my stomach into a heavy, unbearable ache. I was standing in the kitchen, reading the messages, feeling the floor tilt beneath me as my world spun out of control. The betrayal hit like a wave, crashing over me, leaving me breathless, clinging to the counter for support. I'd suspected it, sure, but seeing the proof, those words spelled out in stark black and white, was another level of pain. This wasn't some distant fear or a late-night paranoia. This was real. This was my life, my marriage, shattered in a few lines of text. I didn't confront her right away. I didn't know how to. I'd read the words, felt the betrayal, but the thought of facing her, of speaking those words out loud, felt impossible. I went to bed that night, lying beside her in the darkness, my mind racing with the horrible knowledge that she wasn't truly mine anymore. That perhaps she never really had been. Days turned into a blur. I went through the motions of work, home, dinner, pretending everything was normal while a storm brewed inside me. I started drinking more, taking the long way home, anything to avoid facing her, to delay the inevitable confrontation that I knew was coming. I couldn't look at her the same way, couldn't bring myself to touch her, to even sit in the same room for too long. I didn't trust myself to hold back the anger, the grief that churned beneath the surface. Eventually, though, I couldn't bear it any longer. One evening, after a particularly long day, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, a small, content smile on her face. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I looked at her, at the woman I'd loved for so many years, and all I could feel was betrayal. I confronted her, my voice shaking as I spoke. I demanded answers, explanations, anything to make sense of the mess our lives had become. She denied it at first, her face a mask of shock and anger, as if I were the one who had wronged her. But when I brought up Mike, her face paled, and she couldn't look me in the eye. That's when she said it, the one thing I never expected. The words that would change everything. She was pregnant. She tried to tell me it was mine. That despite everything, this child was ours. But the damage was done. The trust, the love, all of it had been fractured beyond repair. I didn't know if I could believe her, if I could believe anything she said. The news of the pregnancy shook me. It was one thing to know about the affair, to carry that private pain. But a child, that was something else entirely. A child would bind us together, connect us forever. Even if I chose to leave, it would force me to confront my own beliefs about loyalty, family, and responsibility. And despite my anger, I couldn't turn away from that child, not if it was mine. Not even if it was his. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension and doubt. Evelyn swore it was my child, told me that the affair had been brief, a mistake, and she begged for my forgiveness. But the trust was gone, replaced by a bitter uncertainty that consumed every part of me. I couldn't look at her without wondering, without doubting, and as the weeks went on, the weight of that uncertainty began to crush me. Every time I thought of the child growing inside her, a flicker of hope would stir in me, a fragile, desperate hope that maybe this child could be mine, that maybe we could salvage some small piece of the life we'd built together. But in the dark, quiet moments, the doubt would creep back in, gnawing at my heart, filling me with a sickening dread. I was stuck in a limbo, torn between hope and despair, between loyalty and betrayal, and with each passing day, the weight of that choice grew heavier, pulling me down into a darkness I didn't know if I could escape. The months that followed the revelation felt like a never-ending nightmare. I was living in a constant state of dread and suspicion, trying to keep up appearances, hoping against all odds that I could salvage something from this wreckage. Each day with Evelyn was a balancing act, a tightrope walk between anger and apathy, between resentment and resignation. I'd lie awake at night beside her, trapped in my thoughts, wondering how we'd gotten here, wondering if we'd ever get out. I wanted answers, clarity, something to ease the ache in my chest. But every time I tried to talk to her, to bridge the chasm between us, I found myself confronted with walls, defensiveness, excuses. She claimed it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, something she regretted deeply, and maybe she did regret it. Maybe she wanted to fix things, to go back to the way things were. But the trust was gone, the sense of safety, the certainty that we were a team that had vanished, replaced by an emptiness that grew with every lie, every half-truth. Then there was the child, the constant reminder of her betrayal. As Evelyn's belly grew, so did the tension in our home. She wanted to move forward, to put the past behind us and focus on the baby. But I couldn't. I was haunted by the thought that this child might not be mine, that I might be raising the product of her affair, a constant reminder of her betrayal. I couldn't bring myself to bond with the baby, to feel any sense of attachment or responsibility, not while that doubt hung over me like a shadow. And yet, I couldn't leave. Every time I thought about walking away, I felt the weight of my own values pressing down on me. I'd been raised to believe that family was everything, That a man's duty was to his wife and children. That loyalty was the foundation of a strong family. My mother had drilled these beliefs into me from a young age. And even now, even in the face of Evelyn's betrayal, those values held me back, kept me tethered to a life that no longer felt like my own. My mother, of course, had her own thoughts on the matter. She'd noticed the distance between Evelyn and me, the tension that simmered beneath the surface, and she wasted no time in reminding me of my responsibilities. She told me that marriage wasn't easy, that it took work, sacrifice, forgiveness. She spoke of my father, of the rough patches they'd gone through, of the times they'd fought, of the moments when she doubted if they'd make it. But they'd stayed together, and in the end, that commitment had brought them closer, had made their love stronger. But this wasn't a rough patch. This was betrayal, a violation of the trust that was supposed to be the foundation of our marriage. I couldn't just forgive and forget, couldn't pretend that things could go back to the way they were. And yet, each time my mother talked about family, about duty, about loyalty, I felt a pang of guilt, a sense that maybe I was being selfish, that maybe I needed to find a way to move on, to make peace with the past for the sake of the child. For the sake of my family. Evelyn, too, seemed to be leaning into the idea of a fresh start, pushing for forgiveness, for a new beginning. She'd talk about the baby, about the future, about the life we could build together if only I'd let go of my anger, my resentment. She'd apologize, over and over, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching mine as she begged me to see the love she still claimed to feel. The commitment she swore was still there. But I couldn't let go, couldn't forgive, couldn't forget. Every time I looked at her, I saw Mike, the man she'd chosen over me, the man she'd allowed into her life, into her heart. Even as she stood beside me, even as she shared my home, my bed, I saw the betrayal, the lies, the shattered dreams, and I couldn't bring myself to look past them. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep lying to myself, to Evelyn, to my family. I told her I wanted a separation, that I needed space, time to think, to decide what I wanted, what I was willing to forgive. She fought me on it, begged me to reconsider, to think of the baby, to think of our life together. But I couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies, couldn't live a life shadowed by betrayal. That's when Evelyn took the next step, the one that would change everything. She filed for custody, demanding full parental rights, financial support, and an arrangement that would keep me tied to her, to the child, for the foreseeable future. It felt like a trap, a desperate attempt to keep me in her life, to bind me to her despite the broken trust, despite the shattered promises. And as much as I wanted to walk away, to leave her and the mess she'd made, I couldn't ignore the implications of her demands. I knew that if I walked away, if I refused to fight, I'd be leaving a piece of myself behind, a piece of my own integrity. The worst part, though, was yet to come. As the custody battle unfolded, my mother stepped in, taking Evelyn's side, insisting that I stay, that I take responsibility for the child, for my family. She argued that blood didn't matter, that what mattered was commitment, loyalty, love. She told me that I had a duty to the child, that I couldn't just walk away because of a mistake. Her words felt like a betrayal, a twisting of the values she'd instilled in me, a reminder that even my own family couldn't see the pain I was carrying, the weight of the betrayal that had torn my life apart. It was a bitter, surreal experience, watching my own mother testify against me, watching her take Evelyn's side, arguing that I needed to take responsibility for the child, to put family first, to let go of my anger and resentment. I felt abandoned, isolated, a man without allies, without support, trapped in a nightmare of loyalty and betrayal. I knew then that I had only one option, one way to reclaim some semblance of control, of dignity. I demanded a DNA test, determined to know the truth, to face the reality of my situation, no matter how painful it might be. It was a decision born of desperation, of a need to find some clarity, some closure, in a world that had spun out of control. The backlash was immediate. My mother accused me of betrayal, of abandoning my family, of turning my back on the values she'd raised me with. Evelyn was devastated, pleading with me to trust her, to believe in the love we'd once shared. But I couldn't continue living in the shadow of doubt, couldn't keep pretending that the life we'd built was anything more than a fragile illusion. The DNA test was my last hope, my final attempt to uncover the truth, to find some clarity in the chaos that had become my life. And as I waited for the results, I felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would set me free. Waiting for the DNA test results was like holding my breath underwater. My lungs burning, every nerve frayed and raw. Days stretched into an eternity, each moment passing like a slow drip, wearing me down. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was betraying someone, no matter the outcome. Either I was doubting a woman who, despite her infidelity, wanted to build a future with me and our supposed child, or I was setting myself up for a truth so bitter it would cut ties I thought were unbreakable. Evelyn's pregnancy, once a source of hopeful anticipation, became a minefield of conflicting emotions. Her belly grew, a reminder that life was progressing even as our relationship disintegrated. The baby's movements, which she eagerly shared, only added to my turmoil. "Feel it," she'd say, taking my hand and pressing it to her stomach. I'd play along, hiding the turmoil churning beneath the surface, feeling more like an outsider than a future father. My mother, always a voice of principle, amplified the tension with her unyielding stance. She made no secret of her disapproval over my decision to question the child's paternity. Family, she reminded me at every opportunity, was about commitment, about doing what was right even when it wasn't easy. Every conversation with her was another guilt trip, a veiled accusation that I was turning my back on everything she'd taught me. I tried to explain my position, to make her understand the betrayal, the sense of violation I couldn't shake, but my words fell on deaf ears. To her, I was the one destroying the family by letting my pride get in the way. She saw my insistence on the DNA test as a selfish, petty move, a refusal to forgive and move forward for the sake of the child. One evening, after a tense phone call with her, I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, staring at old photos scattered across the coffee table, pictures of happier days, reminders of the life I'd built with Evelyn, the memories I'd cherished, now tainted by the choices we'd both made. There was one photo in particular, a candid shot of my mother, Evelyn, and me at a family barbecue, laughing over some shared joke. It felt like looking at strangers. The weight of it all was crushing. I was caught between two opposing forces, my own need for truth and my family's demand for loyalty. It seemed impossible to reconcile them, to satisfy both without losing myself in the process. And as much as I tried to convince myself that the DNA test was necessary, that it was the only way to find peace, a part of me wondered if I was, in fact, betraying my family, violating the values I'd been raised with. My mother's relentless loyalty to family began to feel less like support and more like an indictment. An accusation that I was somehow lacking. Flawed, she saw the child as a symbol of redemption, a chance to restore our family's unity. To her, the child's biological parentage was irrelevant. What mattered was my willingness to step up, to fulfill my duty. In her mind, I was abandoning a child who had done nothing wrong, who needed a father, who deserved a stable home. But what about my own sense of betrayal? My own pain, didn't that matter? It felt as though my feelings had been disregarded, as though I were being forced into a role I hadn't chosen, hadn't agreed to. I was expected to sacrifice my own sense of self, my own boundaries, for a family that seemed to value its image more than the well-being of its individual members. As the days wore on, Evelyn's pleas became more desperate. She tried everything: tears, apologies, even promises of counseling. She told me that we could rebuild, that the child could bring us closer, heal the rift between us. But all I saw was a trap, a future shackled to a past that had already proven too painful to bear. Every time I tried to picture a life with Evelyn, with the child, I felt a hollow ache, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of love or commitment could fill. I wanted to believe that family was everything, that loyalty and duty could outweigh betrayal and pain, but the reality was far more complex. I was a man who needed honesty, who needed trust to feel whole, and that trust had been shattered beyond repair. The day the DNA test results arrived, I was alone in my office, a quiet, sterile room that had become a refuge from the chaos of my life. I held the envelope in my hands, feeling its weight, the enormity of the truth it held. For a moment, I considered not opening it, letting the answer remain a mystery, sparing myself the pain of confirmation. But I knew that wasn't an option. I'd come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. I took a deep breath and opened the envelope, unfolding the paper with hands that trembled, my eyes scanning the words that would seal my fate. The test was conclusive. I was not the biological father. The child growing inside Evelyn was the product of her affair, the culmination of her betrayal. A strange calm washed over me, a numbness that dulled the sharp edge of the pain I'd carried for so long. There was no more doubt, no more uncertainty. The truth was there, undeniable and final. In that moment, I felt a release, a shedding of the weight I'd been carrying, the endless cycle of doubt and guilt finally broken. But as the relief settled in, a new wave of sorrow washed over me. The child, an innocent soul, was still there, still growing, still needing love, stability, a future. My mother's words echoed in my mind, her voice urging me to rise above, to put aside my pride, to remember the values I'd been raised with. Family comes first. But this wasn't my family. The child was a stranger to me, a reminder of the life I'd lost, the trust that had been broken. I realized then that I couldn't be the father Evelyn wanted me to be, the father my mother expected me to be. I couldn't live a lie, couldn't sacrifice my own happiness, my own integrity, for the sake of an ideal that no longer held meaning for me. That night, I made the decision to leave. It wasn't an easy choice, and it wasn't one I took lightly. I knew the fallout would be immense, that my mother would see it as a betrayal, a rejection of everything she taught me. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. I was choosing my own path, my own values, even if it meant losing the support of the family I'd once cherished. As I packed my things, I felt a strange sense of peace. The life I'd known was ending, but I was finally free. Free to rebuild, to find a new path, a new sense of purpose. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, that I'd face judgment, criticism, even anger from those who couldn't understand my choice. But I was ready. I was ready to live a life that was honest, true to who I was, even if it meant walking it alone. Walking away didn't offer the peace I'd hoped for. I expected some kind of closure, maybe even relief, but as the days turned into weeks, the decision I'd made only deepened the divide between me and my family. They couldn't understand why I'd chosen to leave, why I'd walked away from a child who, according to them, needed me. The DNA results might have told me I wasn't the biological father. But in my mother's eyes, that didn't change a thing. Family, she argued, went beyond biology. It was about commitment, duty, a legacy she expected me to uphold, no matter the cost. When the custody papers arrived, I stared at the document in disbelief. Evelyn had filed for child support, for legal recognition of my role in the child's life. Despite the DNA test results, part of me suspected she knew this would complicate things, that dragging me back into her life through the court would keep me tethered, keep me within reach of her attempts to salvage some version of our broken marriage. But the depth of her persistence felt like a punch to the gut. What hit me hardest, though, was seeing my own mother's name among those set to testify in Evelyn's favor. My mother had made her stance clear. She believed I should man up and take responsibility for this child. Biological or not, to her, my decision to leave was a betrayal, a violation of the family code she'd raised me on. In her mind, this wasn't about who was the biological father. It was about protecting an innocent child and keeping the family from falling apart. She believed my choice had stained our family's legacy, that I'd put my pride above my responsibilities. She couldn't or wouldn't see the pain I was carrying, the toll that staying would take on my sanity, my dignity. The day of the hearing, I felt like a stranger walking into my own life. I arrived at the courthouse early, my hands trembling slightly as I stepped into the dim, echoing corridors. The air was thick with the tension of unresolved arguments, a testament to the reality that I couldn't simply walk away from this battle. My mother was already there, seated beside Evelyn, the two of them huddled close, sharing whispered words. My mother didn't even look at me as I took my place. I felt a pang of loss as I watched them, two people I'd loved. People who had once been my family, now aligned against me. The hearing was grueling. Evelyn's attorney painted a picture of a dedicated mother, a woman committed to providing a stable, loving home for her child. And there I was, cast as the man who'd abandoned his responsibilities, the father who was too selfish, too wrapped up in his pride to do what was right. The argument was that my bond with Evelyn, our years of marriage, created a responsibility that went beyond the results of any DNA test. According to Evelyn, I was still the only real father the child would have. And then my mother took the stand. I'll never forget the look on her face as she spoke, a mask of disappointment mingled with resolve. She recounted how she'd raised me to value family above all else, to put duty and loyalty before my own needs. She spoke of my father's dedication, how he'd worked 2 jobs to support us, how he'd made sacrifices to keep our family together, even when things got hard. She told the court that I was failing in my duty, that I was putting my own pride before the needs of an innocent child. A child she considered part of our family, regardless of biology. Her words were a knife, twisting deeper with each sentence. I felt exposed, humiliated, as if my life, my choices, were on trial for the whole world to judge. She was my mother, the woman who taught me how to be a man, how to live with integrity, and now she was tearing down everything I'd fought for. Every boundary I'd tried to set. She was pleading with the court to force me into a role I hadn't chosen, to bind me to a life that was no longer my own. When it was my turn to speak, I stood there, feeling the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. I spoke as honestly as I could, trying to explain the pain of betrayal, the agony of realizing that my life, my marriage, had been built on lies. I explained that I wasn't walking away out of pride, but out of a need for self-respect, for a life that was based on truth rather than deception. I told the court that I couldn't be a father to a child that wasn't mine. Not under these circumstances. I tried to make them understand that my choice wasn't about abandoning a child but about reclaiming my own sense of dignity, my own peace of mind. But the court wasn't interested in my pain, my betrayal. They were concerned with the welfare of the child, the legal ties that still bound me to Evelyn, the obligations they argued I'd assumed when I married her, and with my own mother's testimony, with her words echoing in the judge's decision. The ruling came swiftly. I was ordered to provide support, to fulfill my responsibilities as the de facto father. The legal system had spoken, and so had my family. I left the courthouse that day feeling hollow, defeated, the reality of my new life settling over me like a dark cloud. My mother approached me as I walked out, her face a mixture of sorrow and resolve. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip firm as if she were trying to transfer her own sense of duty. Her own unwavering belief in family first. Someday, she said softly, you'll understand, you'll see that family means sacrifice. That sometimes we have to put others before ourselves. I couldn't muster a reply. There were no words that could bridge the gulf that had opened between us. She saw my silence as acceptance, as a sign that I'd come to terms with her choice, with the life she'd helped impose on me. But in my heart, I knew that something had broken between us, something that would never be the same. Over the next few weeks, I did what was required of me. I complied with the court's orders, paid the support, visited Evelyn and the child when expected. On the surface, I played the role that everyone had demanded of me, but each interaction, each visit, was a reminder of the life I'd lost, of the freedom I'd sacrificed for the sake of a family that no longer felt like my own. Inside, though, I was a shell of the man I'd once been. The bitterness, the resentment, the sense of betrayal gnawed at me, eating away at whatever remained of the loyalty, the love I'd once felt for my mother, for Evelyn, even for the idea of family itself. I'd done what they asked, given him the sacrifice they demanded, but the price was higher than I could have imagined. In the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I found myself questioning everything I'd once believed. What did family mean, if it required such a deep betrayal of self? What was loyalty, if it demanded silence in the face of dishonesty? If it required a man to ignore his own dignity, his own pain? As the months wore on, I knew I couldn't continue like this. I couldn't live a life that felt like a prison, bound by expectations I hadn't chosen, trapped in a role that felt foreign and wrong. So, I made the decision to break free, to reclaim my life, to find my own path. Regardless of the judgment, regardless of the disappointment, I chose to distance myself from those who couldn't understand, to let go of the relationships that had become a source of pain rather than support. In the end, I found a kind of peace. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned, and it wasn't the family I'd once dreamed of, but it was my life, on my terms, a life where I could live with integrity, free from the weight of expectations that had nearly broken me. The months following the courtroom decision were quiet, but they were anything but peaceful. I drifted through my days, fulfilling my obligations mechanically, my mind numb with the routine. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd once dreamed of starting a family, of building a life that would matter. A life filled with purpose and love. Now, the only thing left of that dream was a sense of duty I didn't feel. A weight I carried without pride or satisfaction. I kept my distance from Evelyn as much as I could. She moved forward as though nothing had happened, sending updates about the baby, trying to draw me into the fold of her new life. She spoke as if we could carve out some semblance of family despite everything. As though the DNA test and the betrayal could be swept away with a forced smile and a shared responsibility. But I couldn't pretend. I felt like an actor in a play I hadn't agreed to perform. Showing up because I had to, not because I wanted to. My mother, too, tried to bridge the silence between us. Though her tone remained firm, her resolve unshaken, she'd call, leaving messages about family gatherings, updates on relatives, even invitations to dinner, but every conversation was laced with a reminder of the choices I'd made, of the values she believed I'd betrayed. Family means more than just blood, she'd say, as if I hadn't heard those words 1,000 times before, as if there was some sacred mantra that could erase the pain I carried. I went along for as long as I could, but eventually, I realized I had to break free. I had to step away, to create distance between myself and the life that had become my prison. So, I took the first real step in reclaiming my autonomy. I filed for a formal separation, severing the last threads that bound me to Evelyn. It was a decision that came with a fresh wave of guilt, of doubt. But I knew it was the right one. I couldn't continue living a lie, couldn't keep pretending that this life was mine when it had been built on a foundation of deception. Around this time, I began seeing a therapist, someone to help me untangle the emotions that had been twisting inside me for so long. Therapy became a place where I could finally let go of the anger, the resentment, the sense of betrayal that had colored every part of my life. I spoke about my mother, about the expectations she'd placed on me, the values she'd instilled. I spoke about the pain of seeing her stand against me in court, of watching her loyalty shift to Evelyn in a way that felt like a knife to the heart. In those sessions, I began to understand something I hadn't seen before: my mother's beliefs. Her loyalty to family weren't about me, they were about her. They were about the life she'd built, the legacy she wanted to protect. She couldn't see my pain because it would mean acknowledging the cracks in the very foundation she'd dedicated her life to upholding. Her insistence on family, her refusal to let me walk away, had been less about love and more about preserving an image, a set of ideals she'd clung to for so long that they'd become more important than her own son. With each session, I felt myself healing, letting go of the anger, the disappointment, the shame. I began to realize that family wasn't a one-size-fits-all concept. It wasn't about blood, or duty, or a set of rules dictated by someone else. Family was about trust, about mutual respect, about choosing to be there for the people who saw you, who understood you, who loved you for who you were, not who they expected you to be. I started making changes, small at first, but each one felt like a step toward freedom. I moved to a different part of town, found a new apartment that felt like my own. I started spending time with friends I hadn't seen in years, people who knew me outside of my role as husband, son, or de facto father. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself, not for the expectations of others. One evening, after a long day of work, I sat in my new apartment, the quiet settling around me like a warm blanket. I thought about the life I'd left behind, the marriage, the family, the dreams I'd once held so close. I thought about the child, the innocent soul I'd walked away from, and the pang of guilt was still there, sharp and persistent, but I also felt something new, a sense of peace, of acceptance. I'd made my choice, not out of selfishness, but out of a need to live honestly, to stay true to who I was. Over time, I found myself reconnecting with my siblings, with cousins, with friends who had watched my struggle from a distance, offering quiet support without judgment. They didn't push, didn't question, they simply listened, offering a space where I could be vulnerable, where I could heal without the weight of expectations. I realized then that family wasn't about duty or blood, it was about connection. About the people who stood by you even when they didn't understand, who loved you even when you didn't meet their expectations. One day, I found myself at a local park, watching families play, children laughing and chasing each other across the grass. I felt a twinge of longing, a wistful ache for the family I'd once dreamed of, for the life I'd left behind. But there was no bitterness, no regret, only a quiet acceptance, a recognition that life doesn't always go according to plan, that sometimes the path we choose isn't the one we'd envisioned but the one we need to walk. I thought about the child Evelyn was raising, the child who would grow up with her own version of family, her own story, her own path, and I realized that, in a way, I'd given her a gift. I'd chosen to step away, to make room for a life that was honest, free of resentment or bitterness. I'd chosen to let her grow up in a world where she wouldn't be a reminder of pain, but a source of joy and possibility. As the sun set over the park, casting a warm glow across the grass, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. I knew I'd never have the life I'd once imagined, but I'd found something else, something more valuable, a sense of self, a sense of peace, a life that was mine, unburdened by the weight of others' expectations. In the end, I learned that family isn't something you're given, it's something you choose. Something you build with the people who see you for who you are, who accept your flaws, your choices, your need for freedom, and for the first time in a long time, I was free to live a life that was true to me, a life that was built not on duty or obligation, but on choice, on respect, on love. It's been years since I walked out of that courthouse, since I let go of the life I thought I had to live. Back then, it felt like the end of something, the end of family as I knew it, of a future I'd once cherished. But now, looking back, I can see it wasn't an end. It was a beginning, though it took me a long time to realize that. For a while, the hurt lingered, the kind of pain that comes from realizing the people closest to you might never fully understand you. But as time passed, that pain transformed. It became a teacher, showing me things I would never have learned otherwise. I learned that family, the kind my mother preached about, could be as fragile as it was fierce, bound by expectations that could either strengthen you or trap you. And I learned that sometimes loving someone means stepping away, even if it means facing the world alone. After I left, I spent time rebuilding, not just my life, but myself. I found interests I'd left behind, picked up a guitar I hadn't touched since college, took up hiking, explored parts of the country I'd only read about in travel magazines. I found pieces of myself in those places, pieces that had been lost under years of responsibility, of marriage, of a life lived to fulfill someone else's dreams. Each step away from the past felt like reclaiming something that had always been mine. People came and went, friendships blossomed and faded, but one thing remained constant: I was finally at peace with my choices. The guilt I once felt for stepping away from Evelyn and her child faded. I realized that if I'd stayed, I would have become a shadow of myself, a man so embittered by duty that he couldn't offer real love to anyone, least of all an innocent child. By leaving, I gave both of us a chance to live fully, to seek happiness in lives that weren't bound by resentment or obligation. My relationship with my mother, on the other hand, was harder to mend. She struggled to understand my decision, even after all these years. In her eyes, my choice was a rejection of her values, a rejection of the life she'd worked so hard to provide. We spoke less often, our conversations brief, polite, each of us careful not to touch the raw memories that still lingered between us. I'd like to say that one day we reconciled, that she came to see my side, But life isn't always so clean. Sometimes, healing isn't a single moment of understanding but a series of small gestures. Unspoken forgiveness woven into a quiet peace. Over time, I found family in places I'd never expected. I grew close to a neighbor, an older man named Henry who lived down the hall in my new apartment. He was a retired professor, a widower with stories that seemed to stretch back to the beginning of time. We'd share a drink on quiet evenings, swapping tales and philosophies, both of us learning from each other in ways that were simple but profound. Henry didn't judge my choices, he understood that life, with all its twists and turns, rarely offers easy answers. And then there was Maria, a friend who grew into something more over the years. She was a schoolteacher, gentle and perceptive, with a heart that seemed to hold the world. She listened to my story without judgment, without the weight of expectations, simply offering her presence as a balm for my scars. We built something together, not the idealized family I'd once dreamed of, but a connection rooted in respect, in understanding. She showed me that love could be gentle, that it didn't have to come with conditions or obligations. One evening, as I sat with Maria and Henry at a small dinner gathering, laughter filling the room, I looked around and felt something settle in my heart. It wasn't the family I'd envisioned, but it was family nonetheless, a chosen family, built on trust, on shared experiences, on mutual respect. It was enough, more than enough, because it was real. Looking back now, I realize that the greatest lesson I learned was this: family isn't a matter of blood or duty, it's a matter of choice. It's the people who see you for who you are, who stand by you even when the road gets rough, who offer love without conditions. My journey wasn't about abandoning family, it was about finding one that fit me. One that I could cherish without sacrificing myself. As I sit here, reflecting on the life I've built, I feel a quiet sense of fulfillment. I know I'll never have the traditional family I once dreamed of, the house filled with children, the legacy my mother envisioned. But that's all right. I've found something else, something just as precious, a life that feels true to me, a life that honors who I am. I sometimes wonder what Evelyn's child is like, if she has his eyes or her mother's smile. I wonder if she's growing up in a world filled with love, if she'll someday understand the choices that shaped her life, even if she never knows my part in it. I hope she's happy, free to be herself, unburdened by the weight of other people's expectations. And I hope she finds a family, a chosen family, who loves her for exactly who she is. In the end, I've made my peace. Life has taught me that family isn't something you inherit, it's something you create. Something you nurture with the people who stand beside you, who offer love freely, without strings or obligations. And with that knowledge, I feel ready to face whatever the future holds. For the first time in my life, I'm free to live, to love, to be myself. And in that freedom, I've found a kind of happiness that no one can take away.